She was trusted with his future. She was paid to protect him. And she was the last person anyone suspected. At 34, Edith Ortega stood in front of her classroom as a figure of authority, composed, respected, unquestioned. At 18, Jim Garcia sat among her students, young, impressionable, and eager to prove he was more than a teenager on the edge of adulthood. What started as guidance didn't stay professional. What felt like concern slowly became control. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, the damage was already done, ending in a pregnancy that would expose secrets, destroy reputations, and permanently alter lives. Welcome to Crime Obsession. A huge thank you to my subscribers for your continued support as we grow. We are dedicated to bringing you the best told and untold crime stories every single day. If you're new here, please don't forget to subscribe. Edith first noticed Jim in a way that felt ordinary enough to justify. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't struggling in the obvious ways that demanded attention. He was quiet, focused, and unusually attentive for someone his age. While other students drifted through lessons with half-formed plans and wandering eyes, Jim listened. He asked thoughtful questions. He stayed behind after class, not to flirt or linger, but to clarify points most students ignored. To Edith, that attentiveness felt like potential, raw, underused, waiting for someone to take it seriously. She told herself that was all she saw. When she offered after-school tutoring, she framed it as an opportunity. Extra preparation. A chance to sharpen his academic edge before graduation. Jim accepted with visible relief, grateful that an adult had singled him out for something positive. The first sessions were structured, almost formal. They sat across from each other with textbooks open, the classroom quiet and emptied of its usual noise. Edith explained concepts carefully, patiently, praising Jim when he grasped something quickly. "You're sharper than you realize," she told him once, smiling in a way that lingered just a second too long. "You don't give yourself enough credit." That praise mattered more than she knew, or perhaps more than she admitted to herself. Over time, the conversation softened around the edges. A question about an assignment turned into a discussion about stress. Stress led to college plans. College plans drifted into fears about disappointing people, about not knowing who you're supposed to become once everyone stops telling you what to do. Edith listened closely, nodding, offering reassurance that felt personal rather than professional. She shared small pieces of herself in return, carefully chosen fragments that made her seem less like an authority figure and more like someone who understood uncertainty. "You're more self-aware than most people your age," she told him during one of those sessions. "That's rare." Jim flushed at that. No teacher had ever spoken to him that way. It made him feel older, steadier, like he was already stepping into the version of himself everyone expected him to be. He began to look forward to those afternoons, to the quiet room where time seemed to slow and the rest of the world faded out. Edith noticed that too. She began adjusting her schedule so their sessions wouldn't overlap with others. She said it was about focus, about giving Jim the attention he deserved. When he mentioned his parents' expectations or the pressure he felt to be ready for adulthood, Edith framed those concerns as burdens placed unfairly on someone as thoughtful as him. "Most people don't see how much weight you carry," she said once. "They just assume you're fine." That sentence settled into Jim's chest and stayed there. Gradually, the tutoring sessions became less about coursework. Books remained open on the desk, but untouched. Conversations drifted toward personal territory, his friendships, his doubts, the feeling that everyone around him was moving forward while he was still trying to understand himself. Edith never pushed. She let the silences stretch, let Jim fill them with honesty. When he hesitated, she reassured him. When he spoke, she affirmed him. "You can talk to me," she said gently. "I won't judge you." It was meant to sound comforting. It also drew a quiet line between her and everyone else. Edith began to emphasize how different Jim was from his peers. How mature. How thoughtful. How easy it was to talk to him compared to the adults in her own life. who seemed locked into routines and disappointments. She never explicitly asked for secrecy, but she spoke often about privacy, about how people misunderstood things when they lacked context, how not everyone deserved access to thoughts shared in confidence. "What we talk about here," she said one afternoon, her voice calm and reassuring, "is just between us. It's important to have at least one space where you can be honest." Jim agreed without hesitation. It felt natural, even responsible, to protect something that felt meaningful. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Edith was doing what teachers did, supporting a student, encouraging growth. But the tone had shifted in subtle ways. She commented on his insight more than his work. She lingered after sessions ended. She asked how he felt, not how he performed. When Jim skipped a session once because of family obligations, Edith seemed genuinely disappointed, masking it quickly with understanding. "It's okay," she said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just didn't want you to feel like you had to handle everything alone." That concern wrapped itself around Jim, tightening gently. He began to rely on her presence, her words, her steady affirmation. When something troubled him, his first instinct was to wait until their next session. When something went well, he wanted her to know. Edith, meanwhile, felt a growing sense of purpose that had been missing from her life. In Jim's attention, she found validation. In his trust, she felt seen. She convinced herself that she was helping him navigate adulthood, that her involvement was a stabilizing force. Any flicker of doubt was smoothed over by the belief that she was the only adult truly paying attention. What began as guidance had become something narrower, more concentrated. Support turned selective. Care became exclusive. Neither of them named the shift out loud. They didn't have to. It lived in the quiet understanding that formed between them, the sense that whatever this was, it belonged only to them. And in that unspoken agreement, the illusion of guidance settled firmly into place, hiding the truth that the line had already begun to blur. At home, the silence was heavier than anything Edith faced in her classroom. The house she shared with Simon felt preserved rather than lived in, like a place maintained out of habit instead of care. Evenings passed with the television murmuring in the background while they sat in separate rooms, orbiting each other without touching. Conversations, when they happened at all, were functional. Groceries, schedules, bills, spoken without eye contact, without warmth. Simon no longer asked how her day went. Edith stopped offering the details. Somewhere along the way, their marriage had thinned into routine, and routine had hardened into distance. She lay awake most nights listening to the quiet, replaying the version of her life she thought she would have by now. This wasn't the future she imagined when she was younger, when purpose and connection felt inevitable rather than elusive. She told herself that every marriage went through this, that stability mattered more than passion. But resentment crept in anyway, subtle and persistent. She felt invisible in her own home, reduced to a role she no longer recognized. The woman behind the desk at school was admired, respected, needed. The woman behind the front door felt forgotten. It was in that emotional vacuum that Jim's attention began to take on a different weight. At first, she didn't notice the shift. His gratitude for her time felt harmless. His eagerness to speak with her felt flattering, but appropriate. Yet after long quiet nights with Simon, Edith found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Jim, how intently he listened, how carefully he considered her words. The contrast was impossible to ignore. When Jim thanked her for understanding him, something in her loosened. When he told her their sessions were the best part of his week, she felt a warmth she hadn't felt at home in years. It wasn't desire, she insisted to herself. It was affirmation. Proof that she still mattered. But that distinction began to blur. She started checking her phone more often, noticing when Jim hadn't reached out. When he seemed distracted during their sessions, she wondered why. Had she said something wrong? Had she failed him somehow? These thoughts unsettled her, yet she welcomed them too. They made her feel connected to something beyond the quiet erosion of her marriage. At home, Simon noticed the change before Edith did. She was distant, distracted, retreating inward. When he asked if something was wrong, she brushed him off, unwilling to open a conversation she no longer believed could be repaired. Part of her resented him for not trying harder sooner. Another part resented herself for caring less each day. The more disconnected she felt from Simon, the more she leaned into the world she shared with Jim. She justified it as mentorship, as guidance that mattered more now than ever. Jim was at a crossroads, she told herself. He needed someone steady, someone invested. And she was invested, perhaps too much. Her tone in class softened when she addressed him. Her praise became more frequent, more personal. She noticed the way he looked to her for reassurance, the way his posture changed when she spoke. That dependence soothed something restless inside her. It made her feel chosen, irreplaceable. Late at night, when the house was dark and Simon slept on the far edge of the bed, Edith replayed her interactions with Jim in her mind. She told herself she was simply reflecting, assessing how best to support him. But those thoughts came with a longing she refused to name. Her neediness sharpened quietly. She sought his validation without acknowledging it as such. If he canceled a session, she felt a flash of disappointment that bordered on hurt. If he confided in someone else, she felt an unexpected sting of jealousy, an emotion that startled her with its intensity. "This isn't appropriate," a voice whispered occasionally. She ignored it. Professional judgment dulled not because she didn't know better, but because knowing better conflicted with how being seen made her feel. She told herself she deserved something of her own, something that filled the space Simon no longer occupied. She wasn't crossing a line, she reasoned. She was compensating for what was missing. At school, she stayed later than necessary, finding excuses to remain in her classroom long after the halls emptied. The quiet felt different there, charged rather than lonely. It was a space where she felt competent and valued, where her presence mattered. When Jim appeared at her door, she felt a flicker of relief she didn't question. She began sharing more about her own frustrations, carefully framed as lessons rather than confessions. She spoke about compromise, about the danger of settling for a life that didn't reflect who you truly were. Jim listened, absorbing her words with the same attentiveness she admired in him. She mistook that attentiveness for understanding, for connection. What Edith didn't acknowledge was how much she was asking of him without ever making a request. She leaned on his attention to steady herself, to reassure herself that she was still capable of inspiring devotion. Each smile, each earnest response, became a quiet balm for wounds she refused to tend at home. By the time she recognized how much she depended on those moments, the dependency had already rooted itself. The woman behind the desk, the composed professional, was giving way to someone more fragile, more desperate to be seen. And in seeking that recognition from Jim, Edith was no longer guiding him forward. She was anchoring herself to him instead, unaware, or unwilling to admit, that the ground beneath them was beginning to shift. The line between what was appropriate and what simply felt natural shifted so gradually that Edith barely noticed it moving. What began as carefully worded reflections turned into fuller disclosures, fragments of her private life offered in a tone that suggested vulnerability rather than confession. She spoke about loneliness without naming it, about disappointment without assigning blame. Each detail was presented as context, something Jim needed to understand her perspective, her advice, her expectations. She told herself she was modeling honesty. Trust, she believed, could only grow in spaces where truth was welcomed. And so she shared truths, selective ones shaped and softened, about her marriage, about the quiet distance that had settled into her home. She spoke of feeling unheard, unseen, of giving endlessly without receiving the same care in return. She framed these admissions as lessons about adulthood, about how easily people drift apart if they stop paying attention. Jim listened with the same intensity he always had, but now there was something heavier in the air between them. He no longer felt like a student absorbing guidance. He felt like a confidant. The shift unsettled him even as it flattered him. Being trusted with information no one else seemed to know made him feel chosen, elevated above the rest of the world she inhabited. Edith noticed his hesitation and mistook it for maturity. She reassured him gently, telling him that trust was not a burden but a gift. "Not everyone earns this," she said once, her voice calm but deliberate. "I wouldn't share these things if I didn't believe you could handle them." The words settled deep. Jim nodded, unsure how to respond, aware only that something was being asked of him without ever being said aloud. In time, Edith encouraged him to speak more freely as well. She asked about his family, his fears, the pressures he carried quietly. She praised his openness when he obliged, reinforcing the idea that what they shared existed in a space apart from everything else. Their conversations took on a rhythm of exchange, her vulnerability met with his, her reassurance answered by his loyalty. She introduced secrecy carefully, disguising it as discretion. Some conversations, she explained, were better kept private, misunderstood by people who lacked context. "Not everyone would see this the way we do," she said, her tone thoughtful rather than cautionary. "It's easier when fewer voices interfere." Jim accepted this logic, though it left him uneasy. He didn't want to betray anyone's trust, but he also didn't want to lose hers. The idea that she had chosen him specifically to share this part of herself carried weight. It made him feel responsible for preserving what they had built. Late messages began as exceptions. A quick question. A follow-up thought. Edith framed them as moments of clarity that couldn't wait, ideas she didn't want to forget. She apologized for the timing even as she repeated it, thanking him for being available, for understanding. Each apology softened the boundary it pretended to respect. Jim responded because ignoring her felt wrong. Because her gratitude made him feel helpful, necessary. Because saying no felt like withdrawing something he'd already given. Private meetings followed a similar pattern. Edith suggested them as efficiencies, quieter spaces where they could talk without interruption. She emphasized how much more productive they were, how focused he seemed. She praised his commitment, his reliability, subtly reinforcing the idea that he was different from others, more dependable, more aligned with her way of thinking. When Jim questioned whether this was crossing a line, Edith reassured him without dismissing his concern outright. She spoke about boundaries as flexible, contextual. "Rules exist to protect people," she said gently. "But sometimes trust does that better." The logic was convincing, wrapped in care and confidence. Jim wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the discomfort he felt was simply the growing pains of adulthood, the challenge of navigating complex relationships with maturity. What he didn't recognize was how indebted he had become. Each secret she shared felt like a deposit he was expected to guard. Each late conversation felt like proof of his reliability. When he considered pulling back, he remembered her trust, her gratitude, the way she spoke of being disappointed by others who failed to understand her. He didn't want to become another example. Edith sensed this shift and leaned into it, though she might not have named it as such. She praised his discretion, telling him how rare it was to find someone so thoughtful. She spoke of mutual respect, of how meaningful it was to be able to speak freely without fear of judgment. The language of equality masked the imbalance beneath it. Jim began to measure his actions by how they might affect her. He checked his phone more often, aware of the possibility that she might reach out. When she didn't, he wondered if he'd done something wrong. When she did, relief washed over him, followed by a quiet resolve not to disappoint her again. In redefining boundaries, Edith hadn't erased them outright. She had reshaped them into something softer, less visible, harder to name. What remained felt personal rather than professional, mutual rather than guided. And within that blurred space, Jim's sense of choice narrowed even as his sense of importance grew. He believed he was trusted. He believed he was needed. And believing those things made it increasingly difficult to step back, even as a part of him recognized that something essential had already been crossed, quietly, carefully, and without a single clear moment he could point to and say, "This is where it changed." The change did not announce itself with a single unmistakable moment. It unfolded the way habits do, quietly, persistently, until the shape of the relationship no longer resembled what it had once been. What Jim relied on at first was her attention, the steadiness of her voice, the reassurance that someone older and certain believed in him. What Edith relied on was the way he listened, the way his focus never drifted, the way his presence made her feel anchored in a life that had begun to feel hollow everywhere else. She started to notice how much she anticipated their time together. Not just the conversations, but the relief that came with them. When Jim walked into the room, the background noise of her dissatisfaction seemed to fade. She told herself this was natural, human, even. He was thoughtful. He was kind. He appreciated her in ways Simon no longer did. These were facts, she reasoned, not dangers. She reminded herself of Jim's age whenever doubts surfaced. 18, legally an adult. Intelligent, articulate, emotionally aware. She framed these details like safeguards, proof that nothing about their connection was inappropriate. Consent, she believed, was the ultimate measure, and Jim never said no. He never pulled away. If anything, he leaned in. What Edith avoided considering was how carefully she had shaped the space in which that leaning became possible. Physical closeness arrived masked as comfort. A hand lingering on his arm when he spoke about feeling overwhelmed. A hug that lasted a second longer than necessary, justified as reassurance. Each contact felt small enough to dismiss, easy to rationalize as instinctive rather than intentional. She told herself she was responding to need, not creating it. Jim felt the shift immediately, though he struggled to articulate it even to himself. The warmth of her touch sent conflicting signals through him, comfort tangled with unease, validation mixed with something sharper and more confusing. He didn't know whether to interpret it as affection or expectation. He only knew that withdrawing felt unthinkable. Her approval had become a compass. When she smiled at him, he felt steadier. When she seemed distant, anxiety crept in, uninvited and persistent. He wondered if he'd misread something, said the wrong thing, failed to meet an unspoken standard. The idea of disappointing her carried an outsized weight, heavier than any consequence he could clearly name. Edith interpreted his responsiveness as mutual desire. She told herself that what they shared had evolved naturally, that it was no longer confined to roles or titles. She spoke of connection as something rare and fragile, something that demanded honesty rather than restraint. When she hesitated, she reminded herself that denying what felt true would be the real betrayal. Jim tried to make sense of his own reactions. Part of him felt flattered, even exhilarated, by the intensity of her focus. Another part felt trapped by it. He wondered whether his feelings were his own or reflections of the space she had carved out for them. The distinction blurred the longer he sat with it. When intimacy deepened, it did so without spectacle. No dramatic declarations, no sudden rupture. Just a quiet crossing that felt inevitable once it had happened. Edith convinced herself that the absence of resistance was proof enough, that his willingness absolved her of responsibility. She did not dwell on the imbalance she had nurtured, the way his sense of choice had narrowed to preserving what they shared. Jim carried the aftermath in silence. Guilt settled in places he didn't know how to reach. He worried about what it meant, about what it said about him, about how easily he had agreed to something he didn't fully understand. He told himself he should feel empowered, but instead he felt smaller, more uncertain. He thought about creating distance, about reasserting boundaries that now felt theoretical rather than real. But every attempt stalled before it began. He imagined her reaction, hurt, confusion, withdrawal, and the thought was unbearable. Losing her approval felt like losing stability itself. Edith mistook his compliance for certainty. She read his quiet as acceptance, his hesitation as thoughtfulness rather than doubt. When she sensed his unease, she soothed it with reassurance, framing his concerns as normal nerves, temporary discomforts on the path to something meaningful. She positioned herself as both guide and partner, collapsing the distinction without acknowledging it. In her mind, the relationship existed in a space beyond judgment, defined by mutual understanding rather than rules. She did not see how carefully she had rewritten the terms, how much of Jim's consent was entangled with dependence. She saw only what she needed to see, a connection that made her feel alive, chosen, justified. Jim, meanwhile, felt caught between wanting to be enough and wanting to escape. The desire to please her ward with a growing sense of self-betrayal. He didn't know how to name what was happening without unraveling everything that had come before. And so he stayed, suspended in a closeness that offered comfort and confusion in equal measure, unsure whether the cost of leaving would be greater than the cost of remaining. The truth announced itself quietly, without ceremony or preparation, in a way that made it feel unreal at first. Edith stared at the result as if it were a mistake that would correct itself if she waited long enough. Her mind refused to settle on a single thought, jumping instead between disbelief and calculation, fear and denial. This was not how she had imagined consequences arriving, if she had imagined them at all. Her first instinct was control. She replayed timelines, counted days, searched for certainty where none existed. She told herself that panic was useless, that she needed to think clearly, strategically. She reminded herself of what she knew, of what could be managed. Her voice, when she finally spoke to Jim, was calm to the point of being brittle. Jim didn't understand at first. The words landed without context, heavy and incomplete. When their meaning sank in, he felt something drop inside him, a sudden hollowing that left him breathless. He thought of responsibility in abstract terms, college applications, future plans, but this was different. This was permanent. This was real. Edith spoke quickly, filling the silence with options, possibilities, contingencies. She framed the situation as something they would handle together, emphasizing discretion, emphasizing timing. Her language was precise, almost clinical, as if naming logistics could keep emotion at bay. She spoke of privacy as necessity, of silence as protection. Jim listened, nodding automatically, though his thoughts scattered. He felt unprepared in a way that frightened him. The weight of adult consequences pressed down on him, sudden and crushing. He wondered how his life had shifted so dramatically without his consent, how something so enormous had entered his world without asking permission. Fear threaded through Edith's resolve, tightening with every passing hour. Control slipped from her grasp as she imagined exposure, administrators, colleagues, her husband, the careful image she had constructed unraveling in public. She alternated between reassurance and urgency, telling Jim they would figure it out while simultaneously impressing upon him how fragile everything was. At times, desperation surfaced. Her composure cracked, revealing flashes of panic she struggled to contain. She spoke of ruin, of everything she stood to lose, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. In those moments, Jim felt the imbalance more sharply than ever. Her fear became something he was expected to manage, to absorb, to soothe. Secrecy thickened around them, no longer framed as trust but as survival. Edith emphasized the importance of discretion with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every interaction felt fraught, every message loaded with risk. She cautioned him about who might notice changes, about how easily rumors could start. Silence became not just an agreement but a demand. Jim felt isolated, cut off from anyone who might help him make sense of what was happening. He carried the news alone, his thoughts looping endlessly. He wondered what this meant for his future, for the version of himself he had imagined becoming. He felt anger, too, at himself, at her, at the situation, but it had nowhere to go. Edith oscillated between reassurance and control, between telling Jim he mattered and reminding him of what was at stake. She spoke of shared responsibility, yet her concerns centered on preservation, of reputation, of stability, of a life already slipping away. She did not ask him what he wanted. She assumed alignment. The reality of the pregnancy pressed in on Jim in quiet moments, catching him off guard. In class, at home, during conversations that suddenly felt trivial, he felt the enormity of it settle into his chest. He thought about telling someone, about seeking clarity from an adult who wasn't entangled in fear. But the idea felt like betrayal, like lighting a match in a room full of gas. Edith's panic sharpened as time passed. The future no longer felt abstract. It loomed, heavy and unavoidable. She began to speak in absolutes, framing choices as necessities rather than options. Her need for control intensified, her fear of losing everything eclipsing any space for reflection. Jim felt trapped between loyalty and survival. He wanted to believe there was a way forward that didn't involve sacrificing himself, but he couldn't see it clearly. Every path seemed to lead to loss. He felt older than he had ever felt before, burdened with decisions he wasn't equipped to make. Secrecy became suffocating. The weight of what they carried together, and separately, made even silence feel loud. What had once been hidden with intention now felt like a threat that followed them everywhere. And beneath it all lay the unspoken truth neither of them wanted to face, that some consequences, once set in motion, cannot be managed, only endured. Jim's mother sensed it before she could explain it. The change arrived gradually, subtle enough to be dismissed at first. Missed jokes at the dinner table, longer pauses before answering simple questions, a restlessness that settled into him like a second skin. He moved through the house as if he were bracing for something, shoulders tense, eyes alert in a way that felt unfamiliar. When she asked how school was going, his answers shortened. When she asked about his plans, he deflected. She told herself it was stress. 18 was a threshold age, heavy with expectation. College decisions, pressure to grow up, the fear of stepping into a life that hadn't yet taken shape. But unease lingered. Mothers learned to trust that feeling, the quiet alarm that sounded when something didn't add up. Jim stopped meeting her eyes. He spent more time alone, retreating to his room under the guise of studying, emerging only when necessary. His phone never left his hand, yet he flinched when notifications sounded, silencing it quickly, as though sound itself might betray him. When she entered the room unexpectedly, she caught him minimizing screens, closing apps too fast. She asked if something was wrong. He said no. The word came too quickly, rehearsed. It didn't land. His appetite shifted. Some nights he barely touched his food, others he ate mechanically, distracted, as if he were elsewhere entirely. Sleep eluded him. She heard him pacing late at night, floorboards creaking softly, the rhythm uneven and restless. When she knocked and asked if he was okay, he told her he was tired, that everything was fine. Fine became the answer to everything. She began to ask more specific questions, carefully at first. Was he overwhelmed at school? Had something happened with friends? Was there someone he wanted to talk about? Jim listened, nodding politely, offering partial truths that felt hollow even as he spoke them. His stories lacked detail. Timelines shifted. Names appeared and disappeared. The inconsistencies were small, but they accumulated. A tutoring session that ran too late. A meeting that conflicted with something he'd said the week before. A teacher mentioned casually in passing, spoken of with an intensity that didn't match the context. None of it proved anything, but together they formed a pattern that unsettled her. She watched him more closely after that, not intrusively, but with attention sharpened by concern. She noticed how his posture changed when certain names came up, how his voice tightened when asked about after-school activities. She noticed the anxiety that seemed to spike without warning, the way he scanned rooms as if expecting confrontation. When she pressed again, more firmly this time, he grew defensive. His tone sharpened, frustration leaking through the careful calm he tried to maintain. He accused her of worrying too much, of treating him like a child. The words stung, but what frightened her more was the fear behind them. This wasn't teenage rebellion. This was something else. She began to trust her instincts fully then, allowing herself to consider possibilities she had avoided. She wondered who he was talking to, who might be influencing him. She wondered why he seemed to carry so much weight alone. She wondered what he was protecting, and from whom. One evening, she asked him directly if someone was hurting him. The question hung between them, heavy and fragile. Jim froze. For a moment, She thought he might break. His face drained of color, his eyes filling with something like panic. He shook his head, but the denial lacked conviction. She softened her voice, reminding him he wasn't alone, that whatever it was, they could face it together. She told him she wasn't there to judge or punish, only to understand. The words landed, but not enough to free him. Silence closed in again, thick and impenetrable. Still, the carefully built narrative began to crack. Jim contradicted himself without realizing it, forgetting details he had invented to keep questions at bay. The strain showed. He grew irritable, snapping over small things, then apologizing just as quickly. He seemed exhausted by the effort of holding everything together. She noticed the fear then, not abstract worry, but something sharper. Fear of consequences. Fear of being exposed. Fear of disappointing people whose opinions suddenly felt dangerously powerful. Late one night, she sat alone at the kitchen table, replaying conversations, piecing together fragments. She thought about authority and trust, about how easily lines could blur when power went unquestioned. The thought unsettled her deeply, not because she wanted to believe it, but because she feared it might be true. When she approached Jim again, her tone was different. Quieter. Steadier. She told him she could see he was struggling, that whatever was happening was too big for him to carry alone. She told him secrets had a way of growing heavier the longer they were kept. Tears welled in his eyes, surprising both of them. He looked away, ashamed, as if emotion itself were a betrayal. He didn't speak, but the silence said more than any words could have. It confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Something was wrong, profoundly wrong, and it was unraveling despite every attempt to contain it. The truth, she realized, didn't need to be forced. It was already pushing its way to the surface, demanding air. And no matter how carefully the story had been constructed, no matter how tightly secrecy had been held, it was beginning to fall apart, one uneasy question at a time. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, questions asked too persistently, explanations that no longer held, silences that spoke louder than words. Once the first crack appeared, everything that had been carefully contained began to leak through. It started with a meeting Jim hadn't known was coming. He was called out of class, escorted down familiar hallways that suddenly felt hostile, every step echoing too loudly. The administrator's office smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, ordinary details that clashed sharply with the gravity of the moment. Faces sat across from him, serious and controlled, asking questions that circled closer and closer to the truth. At first, Jim tried to hold the line. He repeated fragments of the story that had been built for him, careful not to contradict himself. But pressure has a way of finding weaknesses. The questions became more specific. Dates. Times. Messages. His answers faltered. Fear tightened his throat, and the narrative he had carried alone for so long collapsed under its own weight. By the time Edith was summoned, the institution was already moving. Procedures activated. Protocols followed. What had once been a private entanglement was now a matter of record, stripped of ambiguity and framed in language that left little room for interpretation. Edith entered the meeting with her composure intact, posture straight, expression controlled. She spoke carefully, choosing words that softened edges and emphasized intention. She referenced Jim's age. She spoke of mutual understanding. She appealed to nuance. But the room was no longer interested in explanations. Power had shifted, and with it, the illusion of control. Administrators listened, asked questions, exchanged glances. Documentation appeared, messages, schedules, patterns that painted a picture too coherent to deny. Each detail dismantled another layer of the persona Edith had relied on for years. The respected educator. The trusted authority. The woman beyond suspicion. By the end of the day, whispers had begun. They moved faster than facts ever could, spreading through hallways and inboxes, gaining momentum with every retelling. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Doors closed quietly when she passed. The familiarity of the school environment turned cold, unrecognizable. Jim felt the shift just as sharply. Students looked at him differently, some curious, some judgmental, some sympathetic in ways that felt invasive. His name traveled without him, attached to speculation he had no power to shape. Private confusion became public property overnight. At home, the reckoning arrived with brutal clarity. Simon learned the truth not through careful conversation, but through revelation, abrupt, undeniable, impossible to soften. The betrayal cut deeper than anger alone could explain. It wasn't just infidelity, it was deception layered with recklessness, a collapse of trust that reached into every corner of their shared life. Confrontation followed, raw and unrestrained. Words were spoken that could not be taken back. Accusations flew, defenses crumbled. Edith tried to explain, to contextualize, but explanation sounded hollow now, stripped of the authority they once carried. Simon listened, then stopped listening altogether. The life they had built together fractured in real time. Silence replaced argument, colder and more final. Doors closed. Decisions were made without discussion. What had once been routine became impossible to sustain. Meanwhile, the institution acted swiftly. Edith was removed from her position, escorted out of the building she had navigated with confidence for years. The badge that granted her access was collected. Her classroom, once a place of order and influence, stood empty, its absence louder than her presence had ever been. Jim felt exposed in ways he couldn't articulate. Every question felt like an accusation. Every glance felt like judgment. He was asked to recount events again and again, each retelling draining something from him. His uncertainty, his fear, his confusion, all of it laid bare under fluorescent lights and official scrutiny. He struggled to reconcile how quickly the narrative had changed. One moment, he had been told he was mature, capable, responsible. The next, he was treated as someone who needed protection from a situation he hadn't fully understood while inside it. The shift was disorienting, leaving him unsure of where responsibility ended and vulnerability began. Edith watched her reputation disintegrate from the outside, powerless to stop it. Years of careful professionalism erased in days. Her name, once associated with respect, now carried a different weight, one defined by betrayal and scandal. She became a cautionary tale, stripped of nuance, reduced to headlines and whispers. The exposure left no one untouched. Families reeled. Trust evaporated. Futures rerouted without warning. What had been hidden in private spaces now existed under relentless light, every choice examined, every silence interrogated. And as the truth settled into permanence, one thing became painfully clear: secrecy had not protected anyone. It had only delayed the moment when consequences would demand to be faced, fully, publicly, and without mercy. The days after exposure blurred into one another, marked not by noise but by absence. Edith felt it most sharply in the quiet. The emails stopped first, then the calls. Invitations vanished. Names she had known for years went silent, as if erased by mutual unspoken agreement. She woke each morning to a life that no longer recognized her. Professional ruin arrived with clinical efficiency. Official letters replaced conversations, their language detached and final. Credentials that had once defined her identity now felt meaningless, relics of a life she could no longer access. She avoided familiar places, aware of how quickly recognition turned into judgment. Even anonymity felt hostile, every glance charged with assumption. At home, isolation settled in deeply. Simon moved through the house like a stranger, communicating only when necessary, his detachment sharper than anger. The shared routines that had once sustained them dissolved. Objects remained, but meaning did not. Edith found herself wandering through rooms as if visiting a museum of her own past, everything intact and yet utterly lost. She replayed decisions endlessly, searching for moments where another choice might have altered the outcome. Rationalizations that had once comforted her now sounded hollow, stripped of authority and purpose. The certainty she had clung to dissolved, replaced by the realization that control had always been an illusion. Jim's isolation looked different, but felt no less suffocating. He returned to school under the weight of scrutiny, every interaction tinged with awkwardness. Some people avoided him altogether, others watched too closely, curiosity thinly disguised as concern. He learned quickly that silence did not equal peace. It only created space for others to fill with their own interpretations. Shame crept in unexpectedly, catching him off guard. It surfaced in moments of quiet, when anger had nowhere to go. He questioned himself relentlessly. Had he misunderstood? Had he missed something obvious? He replayed conversations, searching for clarity that refused to appear. Anger followed, sharper and harder to manage. It flared when he thought about the imbalance he had sensed but never named, about how responsibility had been framed as mutual while consequences were not. He felt betrayed by narratives that had promised choice while quietly removing it. Jim struggled with the question that haunted him most. How much of what happened had truly been his decision? The idea unsettled him, destabilizing the sense of agency he wanted to believe he had possessed. Admitting vulnerability felt like surrender, yet denying it felt dishonest. Silence replaced secrecy, but it offered no relief. Without constant messages, without the pressure to maintain a story, he found himself confronting emotions he had postponed. Fear, resentment, grief, each demanded attention. He realized how deeply the situation had shaped his sense of self, bending it around someone else's needs. Edith faced her own reckoning in isolation. The absence of validation was jarring, forcing her to confront the emptiness she had tried to escape. Without a role to perform, without authority to wield, she sat with the reality of what she had done, and what it had cost. She noticed how quickly society closed ranks, how unforgiving exposure could be. Former allies distanced themselves, eager to protect their own reputations. Conversations ended abruptly when she entered rooms. Social exile arrived not through confrontation, but through erasure. At times, she felt defensive, bristling against a world that refused to consider nuance. At others, remorse surfaced painfully, heavy and inescapable. She oscillated between self-pity and self-awareness, struggling to hold both without collapsing under their weight. Jim's anger softened gradually into something more complex. He mourned the version of himself that had believed he was immune to manipulation, that adulthood alone guaranteed clarity. He realized how easily admiration could be weaponized, how subtle the erosion of boundaries could be when framed as care. He sought distance, not just from the scandal, but from the identity it threatened to impose. He wanted to be more than a headline, more than a cautionary tale shaped by someone else's choices. Yet the imprint remained, shaping how he approached trust, authority, and intimacy. Silence lingered between them, heavy and unresolved. There were no conversations to provide closure, no explanations capable of repairing what had been broken. The absence felt final, a quiet acknowledgement that some damage could not be undone through words alone. Time moved forward, indifferent to consequence. Headlines faded. Attention shifted. But the aftermath endured, settling into lives permanently altered. Edith confronted a future narrowed by her own actions, forced to redefine herself without the structure she had relied upon. Jim stepped cautiously into adulthood, carrying lessons learned too early, determined to reclaim autonomy piece by piece. In the end, isolation proved to be the most enduring consequence. Not as punishment, but as truth, a reminder that when boundaries collapse, the fallout reaches far beyond the moment of exposure, reshaping lives long after the noise has died away. Time moved forward in quiet increments, indifferent to what had been lost along the way. Seasons changed. News cycles shifted. New scandals replaced old ones. To the outside world, the story receded into the background, reduced to memory, then rumor, then silence. But for those who had lived inside it, the imprint never loosened its grip. Jim felt the passage of time most clearly in moments that should have felt like beginnings. New environments, new faces, new opportunities, each carried the promise of reinvention, yet none arrived untouched. He found himself measuring choices against an invisible past, second-guessing instincts that once felt reliable. Trust no longer came easily. Authority felt complicated. Praise carried an aftertaste of caution. He thought often about the future he might have had without interference, without expectations shaped by someone else's longing. He wondered how many of his decisions had truly been his own and how many had been guided, nudged, quietly redirected. The realization didn't arrive as anger anymore, but as grief, subtle, persistent, and deeply personal. There were days when he felt older than his peers, burdened by insights earned too soon. Other days, he felt stalled, as if a part of him had been paused while the rest of the world continued forward. He carried both feelings without knowing how to reconcile them. Reflection became unavoidable. In quiet moments, he traced the arc of his own growth, noticing where confidence had fractured and where resilience had taken its place. He learned to name what had happened without minimizing it, to acknowledge the imbalance without surrendering his sense of self entirely. Healing, he discovered, was not about erasing the past, but about reclaiming authorship of the future. Edith's reckoning unfolded differently, shaped by absence rather than possibility. The world she had known no longer offered structure or purpose. Without classrooms, without routines, without the authority that had once affirmed her identity, she confronted a version of herself stripped of defenses. Time forced honesty where denial once thrived. The rationalizations that had sustained her lost their power in isolation. She saw how obsession had masqueraded as care, how control had been mistaken for connection. The clarity arrived slowly, painfully, and without comfort. Her life narrowed in ways she had never anticipated. Opportunities disappeared quietly, doors closing without explanation. Social circles thinned until only distance remained. She lived with the knowledge that a single decision had rewritten her future irrevocably, not as a momentary lapse, but as a defining act. There were moments when regret felt overwhelming, heavy enough to steal her breath. Other times, defensiveness surfaced, a reflex against a world that refused to forget. She oscillated between these states, learning that accountability was not a destination, but a constant, uncomfortable presence. The years taught her what consequences truly meant, not punishment imposed from outside, but loss endured from within. Loss of trust. Loss of purpose. Loss of the version of herself she had believed she was. Obsession, she learned too late, always demanded payment, and it was never as small as promised. Jim's reflections eventually turned outward, toward the life still unfolding before him. He began to imagine a future shaped not by what had been taken, but by what he chose to rebuild. The past would always be part of his story, but it did not have to be the ending. He sought connection with caution, honesty with intention. He learned to listen to discomfort, to recognize when admiration crossed into influence. He carried lessons that could not be unlearned, but also strength that had been forged under pressure. He understood now how easily power could distort choice, how silence could masquerade as consent. That understanding became a compass, guiding him away from repetition. For Edith, the future remained constrained, defined by a line she could never uncross. She learned to live within limits she had once ignored, to accept that some reputations do not recover, some trust does not regenerate. Her days were quieter, marked by reflection rather than ambition. The scandal faded from public memory, but its echoes lingered privately, shaping decisions, relationships, and self-perception. What remained was not spectacle, but consequence, the slow, enduring aftermath of a boundary crossed and a truth revealed. In the end, the cost was not measured in headlines or punishment, but in lives permanently altered. Jim moved forward with awareness earned through loss, determined to claim a future defined by his own needs and values. Edith lived with the weight of a choice that could not be undone, a reminder etched into every quiet moment. Time did not heal everything, but it clarified one truth that neither could escape. When lines are crossed under the illusion of justification, the payment comes not all at once, but over a lifetime, collected in fragments, remembered in silence, and carried long after the world has moved on.